The cabin lights glowed softly, casting a warm, muted haze over the rows of wide leather seats. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, a dark ocean pierced only by faint stars and the distant shimmer of wing lights cutting through the night. It was the kind of long-haul flight where time seemed to dissolve, where conversations faded quickly, and most passengers retreated into their own worlds of silence, sleep, or distraction. In seat 2A, a man sat alone. Keanu Reeves didn't look like someone who belonged to the quiet luxury surrounding him. His clothes were simple: dark jeans, a slightly worn jacket, boots that had clearly seen more pavement than polished floors. No designer logos, no flashy accessories. Just a man blending into the background as if that was exactly where he preferred to be. He leaned slightly toward the window, his gaze fixed not on the screen in front of him, but on the darkness beyond. The glass. There was something distant in his eyes, not sadness exactly, but a depth that suggested years of experience, of stories carried quietly. His hands rested loosely in his lap, fingers occasionally tightening and relaxing, as though tracing thoughts that never quite made it to the surface. Around him, the cabin told a different story. Soft laughter drifted from a couple seated across the aisle, clinking glasses filled with sparkling drinks. A businessman tapped rapidly on his laptop, the glow reflecting sharply off his polished watch. A flight attendant moved gracefully between rows, offering warm smiles and neatly folded blankets. Everything about the environment whispered comfort, status, ease. And yet, in the middle of it all, Keanu seemed untouched by it. He didn't ask for anything. When the flight attendant approached, he responded with a gentle nod and a quiet thank you, his voice calm, almost understated. There was no trace of entitlement, no expectation. Just a simple presence, grounded and still. At first, no one noticed, but recognition has a way of creeping in slowly. It started with a glance, just a fleeting moment from a passenger across the aisle. A second look followed, more focused this time. A subtle narrowing of the eyes, as if trying to match a familiar face with a distant memory. Then came the quiet whisper to the person beside them. "Is that?" A pause. "No. It can't be." But it was. The realization spread like a quiet ripple through the cabin. Heads turned, then quickly turned back, trying not to stare. Phones were subtly angled, not quite taking pictures, but hovering in that uncertain space between curiosity and respect. A few passengers leaned closer to each other, murmuring softly, their voices barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Pretty sure that's him. He looks so normal. Why is he alone?" The questions lingered, unanswered. Keanu, if he noticed, gave no sign. His expression remained calm, almost meditative. But there was an awareness in him, a quiet attentiveness. He saw the glances, the whispers, the shifting energy in the room. He always did. Years of living in the public eye had taught him how to feel those subtle changes without reacting to them. Instead, he returned his gaze to the window. For a moment, his reflection stared back at him, faint, ghost-like against the darkness outside. His eyes softened and something deeper flickered beneath the surface. Memories, perhaps. Losses. Moments that shaped him in ways the world would never fully understand. The kind of weight that doesn't show itself loudly, but settles quietly into a person's soul. He exhaled slowly. There was peace in that breath, but also something else, a quiet readiness, as if he knew that stillness never lasted forever. Behind him, a voice rose slightly louder than the rest, breaking the gentle rhythm of the cabin, a sharp tone, confident, almost performative. It carried just enough edge to draw attention without fully disrupting the calm. A few heads turned. Keanu didn't. Not yet. But something in the air shifted, just slightly, like the first distant rumble before a storm reaches the shore. And though the cabin still looked the same, soft lights, quiet murmurs, the steady hum of flight, an invisible tension had begun to form, threading its way through the space, unnoticed by most. Keanu sat still, composed, his presence as quiet as ever. But the calm was no longer untouched. The voice behind him didn't fade like the others. It lingered, sharp, deliberate, cutting through the low hum of the cabin with just enough force to draw attention without openly demanding it. It belonged to a man who was used to being heard, used to occupying space as though it naturally bent around him. A few rows back, he leaned into the aisle slightly, one arm draped casually over the armrest, fingers tapping with restless energy. His suit was immaculate, every detail carefully chosen. Crisp collar, polished shoes, a watch that caught the cabin light every time he moved his wrist. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he had earned the right to be noticed. And now he had found something, or rather, someone, to focus on. "Funny," the man said, his voice carrying just enough to reach beyond his row. "You'd think celebrities would fly private." A couple of passengers exchanged glances. The comment wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. It was precise, intentional. In seat 2A, Keanu Reeves remained still. If he heard it, he didn't react. The man tilted his head slightly, studying him with narrowed eyes. There was something almost irritating, even offensive, about the lack of response. Most people, especially people like him, reacted. They defended themselves, acknowledged the remark, or at the very least showed discomfort. But this silence? It felt like dismissal. "You'd also think," the man continued, a faint smirk forming, "they'd try a little harder not to look like they just walked in off the street." A soft chuckle came from the person seated beside him, uncertain, more out of politeness than genuine amusement. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the direction this was heading. Still, Keanu didn't turn. His gaze remained fixed ahead now, no longer at the window but somewhere beyond it. Focused, yet distant. His posture didn't change, his breathing steady, his hands resting exactly where they had been. But inside, something subtle stirred. Not anger, not even irritation, just awareness. He had encountered this before, the quiet test of ego, the probing need some people had to provoke to measure themselves against others in ways that rarely made sense. It was never really about him. It was about something else, something deeper in the person trying to provoke a reaction. And he knew that reacting would only feed it. Behind him, the man shifted again, leaning forward slightly now, his voice lowering but sharpening. "Or maybe," he added, "some people just get lucky once and spend the rest of their lives pretending they belong." This time, the words landed harder. A woman across the aisle glanced toward Keanu, her expression tightening. A flight attendant paused mid-step, sensing the shift but unsure whether to intervene. The cabin, once softly alive with quiet activity, now held a thin layer of tension, like glass stretched just before it cracks. Keanu slowly turned his head, not abruptly. Not defensively, just enough to acknowledge the presence behind him. His eyes met the man's. There was no challenge in them, no anger. Just a calm, steady gaze that seemed to absorb the moment rather than resist it. For a brief second, the businessman hesitated. It wasn't what he expected. There was no spark to push against, no visible weakness to exploit. Just stillness. Keanu gave a small, almost polite nod, not submissive, not dismissive. Just an acknowledgement, like one stranger recognizing another's presence without inviting anything further. Then he turned back. And just like that, the moment should have ended. But for the man behind him, it didn't. If anything, that quiet, response, so controlled, so unbothered, felt worse than any argument could have. It didn't give him what he wanted. It didn't elevate him. It didn't even validate the attempt. It made him feel small. And that was something he couldn't accept. His jaw tightened slightly as he leaned back into his seat, fingers gripping the armrest now, the easy confidence from earlier beginning to fracture at the edges. Around him, the passengers settled again, but the atmosphere had changed. The whispers had stopped. The curiosity remained, but now it was mixed with something else: anticipation. Because moments like this didn't just disappear, they built. And somewhere between the quiet resilience of Keanu Reeves and the growing irritation of the man behind him, something had already begun to take shape. Something that wouldn't stay contained for long. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet, but it wasn't the same calm as before. This silence had weight. It lingered between rows, stretched thin across the aisle, and clung to the subtle movements of passengers pretending to return to their routines. But attention, once awakened, doesn't sleep so easily. A flight attendant approached with a practiced smile, her voice soft and professional as she offered refreshments to the front row. The gentle clink of glassware and the faint hiss of poured drinks filled the space, momentarily restoring a sense of normalcy. In seat 2A, Keanu Reeves accepted a bottle of water with a quiet nod. "Thank you," he said simply, his tone warm, but restrained. He placed it on the tray without opening it, his focus returning to the stillness ahead. Behind him, the man watched. Not casually, not curiously, intently. There was something about Keanu's composure that didn't sit right with him. It wasn't just the silence, it was the ease of it, as if none of this mattered. As if the remarks, the tension, the quiet eyes watching from every direction were all beneath his notice. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting in his seat again. He needed control back. As the attendant moved closer to his row, he straightened, his demeanor snapping back into something polished and deliberate. "I'll have something cold," he said, his voice smooth again, though a faint edge remained. "Milk." The request seemed ordinary, harmless, but his eyes flicked forward, locking briefly onto the back of Keanu's seat. The attendant nodded, politely, and moved on, returning moments later with a neatly poured glass. The white surface of the milk reflected the cabin lights, still and unbroken. The man took it slowly, his fingers wrapping around the glass with a careful grip. Too careful. He didn't drink it. Instead, he held it there, resting it lightly on the tray table as his gaze drifted again toward the man in front of him. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Small, calculated, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Woman across the aisle noticed. Her brows furrowed slightly. Something about the moment felt off. The engines hummed steadily, the plane cutting through the night with quiet precision. Most passengers had settled again, some with headphones on, others scrolling through screens, but there was still a thread of awareness running through the cabin, connecting them all to what had just happened, and what might come next. Keanu shifted slightly in his seat, adjusting his posture. A small movement, nothing more. But it was enough. The man behind him leaned forward, just a fraction. His fingers tightened around the glass, the surface trembling ever so slightly. Not from turbulence, but from intention. He rose halfway from his seat, as if adjusting himself, as if reaching for something unseen. Then, a sudden jolt. Not from the plane. From him. The glass tipped. Milk spilled forward in a bright, unmistakable arc, splashing across the back of Keanu's shoulder and seeping into the fabric of his jacket before anyone could react. A sharp gasp broke through the cabin. Time seemed to pause. The white stain spread quickly, stark against the dark material, dripping slowly down toward the seat. The man straightened instantly, his expression shifting into one of exaggerated surprise. "Oh," he said, a little too quickly, a little too rehearsed. "That was unexpected." But the smirk didn't quite disappear. It lingered, faint, but present, betraying the truth behind the act. All around them, eyes locked onto the scene. A passenger lowered their headphones. Another leaned forward, unable to look away. The flight attendant froze mid-step, her expression tightening as she took in what had just happened. And in the center of it all, Keanu Reeves sat motionless. For a brief moment, he didn't move. The milk soaked into his jacket, the coolness spreading through the fabric, the weight of the moment settling over him like a quiet storm waiting to break. Every eye in the cabin was on him now, waiting, expecting. Because this was it, the moment the silence would shatter, the moment where anger would rise, where humiliation would demand a response. The moment the man behind him had been building toward. Keanu slowly looked down at his shoulder. Then, just as slowly, he began to turn. And the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Part 4, for a moment, the world inside the cabin felt suspended, like the plane itself had paused mid-air, caught between what had just happened and what was about to follow. Every gaze locked onto him. Keanu Reeves turned fully this time, not just with his head, but with a quiet, deliberate shift of his shoulders. The milk had already begun to soak deeper into the fabric of his jacket, leaving a darkened stain that spread unevenly across his side. A faint drop slid downward, tracing a slow path before disappearing into the seam. The man behind him straightened, preparing. He expected anger, maybe a sharp remark. At the very least, discomfort, something he could respond to, something he could push against. But what he got wasn't any of that. Keanu's eyes met his, calm, clear, unshaken, no flare of emotion, no tightening of the jaw, no visible trace of embarrassment, just a steady presence, as if the moment unfolding wasn't something happening to him, but simply something happening. The silence stretched. Then softly, Keanu spoke. "Are you all right?" The question didn't land the way anyone expected. It didn't accuse. It didn't challenge. It redirected. The man blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Keanu's voice remained even, almost gentle. "Your hand slipped," he said, glancing briefly at the empty glass before returning his gaze. "I just wanted to make sure you didn't hurt yourself." A ripple moved through the cabin, not loud, not visible, but deeply felt. The script had been broken. The man's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. For a second, his confidence faltered, like a crack forming beneath a polished surface. I'm fine," he managed, though his tone lacked its earlier sharpness. Keanu gave a small nod, accepting the answer without question. "That's good," he said quietly. And then, almost unbelievably, he reached for a napkin. Not in frustration, not hurriedly, just calmly. He dabbed lightly at the milk on his jacket, as if it were nothing more than an inconvenience, a minor spill in an otherwise ordinary moment. The movement was unhurried, controlled, absent of any urgency to fix or hide the situation. A flight attendant rushed forward now, her composure strained. "Sir, I am so sorry. Let me help you with that," she said, already reaching for towels. Keanu looked up at her with a faint, reassuring smile. "It's okay," he said. "Really, it was an accident." The words hung in the air. An accident. The man behind him shifted in his seat, his fingers curling slightly against the armrest. The label should have relieved him, should have erased the tension, but instead, it pressed against him. Because everyone in that cabin knew, and more importantly, he knew. Across the aisle, a woman lowered her gaze, shaking her head subtly. Another passenger leaned back, arms crossing, their expression no longer curious but quietly disapproving. The energy had shifted again, but this time it wasn't anticipation. It was judgment. Not loud, not spoken, but undeniable. Keanu continued to clean his jacket, his movements steady, almost meditative. There was no rush to stand, no attempt to escape the situation. He remained present, grounded, unaffected in a way that felt almost impossible. The man watched him, confusion creeping in where confidence once lived. "Why aren't you—" He started, then stopped himself. Keanu glanced up briefly. "Why aren't I what?" The question was simple. Open. The man hesitated, searching for the word he had expected to use. Angry, embarrassed, anything. But none of them seemed to fit anymore. He leaned back slowly, the tension in his posture loosening, not from relief, but from something closer to uncertainty. He muttered, trailing off. Keanu didn't press him, didn't fill the silence. He simply nodded once more, then turned back to face forward. And that was it. No confrontation, no escalation, just quiet acceptance. But somehow, that made everything louder. The man's reflection flickered faintly in the dark airplane window beside him. For the first time since the flight began, he didn't like what he saw. Around him, the cabin slowly returned to motion, but it wasn't the same as before. The whispers had changed in tone, the glances carried meaning now, not curiosity. Respect had shifted, and it hadn't shifted toward him. In seat 2A, Keanu Reeves sat exactly as he had before, calm, composed, quietly present. But the balance of the entire plane had changed, and the man behind him could feel it slipping further out of his control with every passing second. For a while, no one spoke. The engines hummed on, steady and indifferent, but inside the cabin something had changed in a way that couldn't be undone. The tension hadn't exploded. It had settled quietly into something heavier. Something that lingered in glances, in posture, in the subtle distance now forming around the man a few rows back. Keanu Reeves adjusted his sleeve slightly, the damp fabric no longer dripping but still marked. The stain remained visible, a silent reminder of what had just happened. Yet there was no urgency in him to hide it, no discomfort in the way he sat. If anything, he seemed even more grounded, as if the moment had anchored him deeper into himself rather than shaken him. The flight attendant returned with a fresh cloth and a gentle insistence this time. "Please, sir, at least let me help." "A little?" she said softly. Keanu looked up, offering a small, appreciative smile. "Thank you," he replied, allowing her to dab lightly at the fabric. "You're very kind." His tone carried sincerity. Nothing exaggerated, nothing performative, just simple gratitude. The attendant paused for a second, almost caught off guard by how genuine it felt. "It's really no trouble," she said, though her voice softened. "Even more." "We'll have it cleaned as soon as we land," Keanu nodded. "I appreciate that." Behind him, the man shifted again. But this time, it wasn't with confidence. His earlier composure had fractured in ways he couldn't quite repair. The easy smirk was gone, replaced by something tighter, more uncertain. He glanced around, not boldly like before, but cautiously, only to find that the attention he once commanded had turned into something else entirely. People weren't impressed anymore. They were watching, judging. A couple seated nearby leaned slightly toward each other, whispering, not with amusement, but with quiet disapproval. Across the aisle, a man shook his head faintly, then looked away as if he didn't want to be associated with what had just happened. Even the cabin crew, though still professional, carried a subtle shift in their demeanor when passing his row, polite but distant. For the first time, he felt it. Isolation. He cleared his throat, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. "It was just an accident," he said, a bit louder than necessary, as if announcing it might make it true. No one responded, not directly. But the silence that followed said enough. In front of him, Keanu remained still, his focus forward, giving no indication that he had even heard the remark. And somehow, that made it worse. There was no confrontation to push against, no argument to twist in his favor. Just quiet, distance. The man's fingers tapped restlessly against the armrest before stopping altogether. He looked down at his empty glass, then back up again, his thoughts clearly unsettled. Whatever satisfaction he had expected from the moment, it hadn't arrived. Not even close. Meanwhile, the atmosphere around Keanu had shifted in the opposite direction. A passenger across the aisle leaned slightly forward. "Excuse me," she said gently, her voice careful not to intrude. "I just wanted to say, that was incredibly kind of you." Keanu turned slightly, offering a polite nod. "It's all right," he said. "Things happen." "But still," she added, a faint smile forming. "Not everyone would react like that." He paused for a brief moment as if considering her words, then gave a small shrug. "Maybe they would," he replied. "You never really know." There was no pride in his voice, no sense of proving anything, just a quiet belief. The woman leaned back, thoughtful, her respect clear even in silence. Further down the row, another passenger glanced over, then offered Keanu a subtle nod, an unspoken acknowledgement. It was small, almost invisible, but it carried weight. Respect doesn't need volume. It builds quietly. And now, it was building around him. The man behind watched all of it unfold. The shift, the recognition, the way the room seemed to lean, almost imperceptibly, toward the very person he had tried to diminish. His jaw tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected laughter, maybe discomfort. At worst, a confrontation he could control. But this quiet reversal, this unspoken judgment, this growing respect for someone who hadn't even defended himself. It unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. He leaned back slowly, staring ahead now, no longer trying to engage. For the first time since the flight began, he had nothing to say. And in that silence, something unfamiliar crept in. Not anger, not frustration. Something quieter, something heavier. Regret, beginning to take shape. Up ahead, Keanu Reeves sat as he always had, calm, composed, untouched by the need to win or prove anything. But without saying a word he already had, Part 6 time passed, but not in the usual way. Minutes didn't feel like minutes anymore. They stretched, lingered, folded into the quiet weight that had settled over the cabin. The earlier tension hadn't disappeared, it had transformed into something deeper, something more reflective. Conversations were softer now, movements more measured, as if everyone had unconsciously agreed to respect the stillness that had taken hold. Keanu Reeves remained in his seat, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence. The damp mark on his jacket had begun to dry, fading slightly but still visible enough to tell its story. Yet he wore it without discomfort, without even the slightest attempt to conceal it. If anything, he seemed more at ease than before. His gaze drifted again toward the window, where the darkness outside had softened into a faint, distant glow. Somewhere far below, unseen cities slept under scattered lights. But up here, above it all, there was only quiet. And in that quiet, his thoughts moved. Not to the man behind him, not directly, but to something older, something familiar. Moments like this weren't new to him. Not the specifics, the spilled milk, the crowded cabin, but the essence of it. The testing. the subtle cruelty people sometimes carried without fully understanding why. He had seen it before, felt it before, in different forms, in different places. And he had learned something over time. You don't always answer those moments by pushing back. Sometimes you answer them by refusing to become them. A faint memory surfaced, something small, almost insignificant to anyone else. A quiet act of kindness he had once received at a time when he hadn't expected it. No cameras, no recognition. Just a simple moment that stayed with him, shaping the way he moved through the world. He held on to that, not as a story, but as a choice. Behind him, the man shifted again, but this time it was slower, heavier. The restless energy that once defined him had faded, replaced by something more subdued. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, now sat uneven, as if carrying a weight he hadn't prepared for. He glanced forward, not boldly, not challengingly, just cautiously. His eyes settled on the back of Keanu's seat, then dropped briefly to the faint stain that still marked the fabric. It was a small thing, really, easily forgotten in any other moment, but now it felt larger, symbolic. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the drink he had ordered earlier. His fingers hovered near the armrest before pulling back, uncertain. For someone who had spent so much of his life in control, of conversations, of rooms, of outcomes, this lack of control felt unfamiliar, uncomfortable. A flight attendant passed by again, offering a polite smile, but it didn't linger this time. Not the way it had before. It wasn't rude, it wasn't cold, it was simply different, and he noticed. Across the aisle, a passenger adjusted their blanket and glanced toward Keanu, their expressions softening for just a moment before they looked away again. No words were exchanged, but the message was clear. Respect had found its place, and it hadn't chosen him. The man exhaled slowly, leaning back into his seat, his gaze drifting upward toward the dim ceiling lights. For the first time since boarding, there was no performance left in him, no need to impress, no impulse to provoke, just silence. And in that silence, something began to surface, something he hadn't expected to confront on a flight like this. Perspective. He replayed the moment in his mind, the glass tipping, the milk spilling, the brief satisfaction he thought he would feel. And then, the response. "Are you all right?" The words echoed differently now. Not weak, not passive, but deliberate. Stronger than anything he could have said in return. His jaw tightened slightly as he turned his head, just enough to see a partial reflection in the window beside him. It wasn't clear, just a faint outline, but it was enough. Enough to recognize something he hadn't wanted to see. He looked away. Up ahead, Keanu Reeves shifted slightly, adjusting his position, then reached down to pick up the bottle of water he had been given earlier. He opened it quietly, taking a small sip before placing it back down. Simple, unremarkable. And yet, in this moment, it carried weight. Because it wasn't about what he did. It was about what he didn't do. He hadn't retaliated. He hadn't humiliated in return. He hadn't needed to. The balance of power had shifted without force, without noise, without spectacle. And everyone on that plane had felt it. The man behind him closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, staring forward with a different kind of focus now. Not outward. Inward. The flight continued through the night, steady and unchanged. But inside that cabin, inside that moment, something had already begun to change. And it wasn't finished yet. The first hint of morning began to creep along the horizon, a thin line of pale gold stretching beneath the darkness outside the windows. Inside the cabin, the lights dimmed even further, letting that natural glow slowly take over. It was that quiet in-between hour, when night hadn't fully let go and day hadn't fully arrived. Most passengers were awake now, not moving much, not speaking loudly, but aware. The kind of awareness that lingers after something meaningful has happened. In seat 2A, Keanu Reeves sat just as he had for most of the flight. Calm, present, his posture unchanged, his expression steady. If anything, there was a quiet softness in his eyes now, as if the long stretch of silence had given him space to settle even deeper into himself. A flight attendant approached once more, this time carrying a fresh cup of tea. "For you," she said gently. Keanu looked up, surprised. "I didn't order this." She smiled, glancing briefly toward the middle rows before returning her gaze. "I know," she said softly. "Someone asked me to bring it to you." Keanu's brow lifted slightly, not in suspicion, but curiosity. "Thank you," he replied, accepting the cup with both hands, the warmth spreading through his fingers. He followed her glance, and for the first time since everything had happened, his eyes met the man behind him again. But something was different now. The arrogance was gone. Completely. The man sat still, his hands clasped together, his gaze lower than before, not avoiding, but careful. Measured. As if every movement now carried weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, the man stood. The movement alone drew attention. A few nearby passengers looked up, their expressions shifting with quiet anticipation. Not tension this time, but curiosity. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. He stepped forward into the aisle, stopping just beside Keanu's seat. Up close, the difference was even clearer. His shoulders, once rigid with confidence, now seemed slightly lowered. His jaw, once tight with control, had relaxed, but not comfortably. More like someone learning how to carry something unfamiliar. "Hey," he began, his voice quieter than anyone had heard it before. Keanu turned toward him fully, not guarded, not distant, just attentive. The man hesitated, his eyes flickering briefly toward the faint stains still visible on the jacket. That small mark, still there, still undeniable. He exhaled, the word catching slightly. "I wanted to say something." No one interrupted. Even the usual cabin sounds, the rustling, the quiet shifting, seemed to pause around him. He swallowed. "I've been sitting back there this whole time," he continued, his voice uneven but steady enough to carry. "Thinking about what I did." A pause. "And more than that, thinking about how you responded." His gaze lifted slightly, finally meeting Keanu's eyes, not with challenge, not with pride, but with something far more difficult. Honesty. "I tried to embarrass you," he said plainly. "That wasn't an accident." A few passengers exchanged glances. But no, one reacted loudly. The truth didn't need volume. It settled. Heavy. Real. "And you didn't?" He shook his head faintly, almost in disbelief. "You didn't do anything back. You didn't even make me feel small." He let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "I've spent a long time thinking that strength meant being louder than everyone else, sharper, faster, winning, no matter what." Another pause. "But sitting there," he gestured slightly behind him, "watching the way people looked at you, and the way they looked at me." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I got it wrong," he said finally. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything he had said before. "I'm sorry." Silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of recognition, of shift, of something real taking place in a space where, just Hours ago, none of this seemed possible. Keanu held his gaze for a moment. Then gently he nodded. A small gesture, but it landed. "I appreciate you saying that," he replied, his voice calm, unchanged from before. "That takes more than people think." There was no lecture, no superiority, just acknowledgement. The man's shoulders dropped slightly, not in defeat, but in release, as if something he had been holding on to had finally loosened. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Keanu did something no one expected. He picked up the cup of tea, took a small sip, and offered a faint smile. "It's good," he said. The man blinked, caught off guard again, but this time not in discomfort. In understanding. He gave a small nod in return, stepping back slowly toward his seat. Around them, the cabin exhaled. Not loudly, but collectively. Because everyone had just witnessed something rare. Not conflict, not victory, but change. Real, quiet change. As the first light of morning filled the windows, casting soft gold across the rows, Keanu Reeves turned back toward the horizon. The storm had passed. But what it left behind was something far more powerful. Part 8. The plane began its slow descent, the soft hum of the engines shifting in tone as the ground, still far below, started to rise toward them. Morning light now filled the cabin completely, warm and golden, touching every row, every face, revealing what the night had quietly transformed. Seatbelts clicked into place, window shades lifted, people stirred, not with the restless impatience of landing, but with a lingering awareness of what had unfolded between takeoff and now. Conversations resumed, but softer than usual. Glances, still moved, subtle and thoughtful, occasionally drifting toward the front of the cabin. In seat 2A, Keanu Reeves sat as he always had, calm, composed, present. The faint mark on his jacket had dried completely now, leaving only a dull trace behind. It was no longer a disruption, just a reminder. He adjusted his sleeve slightly, then rested his hands again, his gaze moving briefly toward the window where the outline of the city had begun to form. Roads, buildings, life slowly coming into view. Behind him, the man sat in silence. But it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't filled with ego or calculation. It was reflective, grounded. His posture had changed in ways that couldn't be faked. He wasn't leaning into the aisle anymore. He wasn't scanning the cabin for attention. Instead, he sat back, hands resting loosely, his gaze forward, not searching, not performing, just present. Every now and then, his eyes would flicker toward the front, toward Keanu. Not with discomfort, not even with guilt, but with something. Quieter. Respect. As the plane lowered further, a soft chime echoed through the cabin. A flight attendant's voice followed, calm and practiced, guiding passengers through the final moments before landing. Trays were secured, seats adjusted, the familiar rhythm of arrival taking over. But beneath it, something deeper remained. A shift that wouldn't disappear when the wheels touched the ground. The man exhaled slowly, then leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance between rows, not intrusively, not urgently. "Hey," he said, his voice steady this time. Keanu turned his head. Their eyes met once more. "I meant what I said," the man added quietly. "I'm going to remember this." Keanu held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "That's enough," he replied. No more, no less. The simplicity of it settled between them. The plane touched down moments later. First a subtle contact, then the firm roll of wheels against runway. A slight jolt moved through the cabin, followed by the roar of reverse thrust, then the gradual slowing that signaled the end of the journey. But for some, it wasn't just the end. It was a beginning. As the plane taxied, phones turned on, messages flooded in, people prepared to return to their lives, to schedules, to responsibilities, to routines that often move too fast to notice moments like this. But something about this flight would stay in quiet ways, in unseen ways. Passengers began to stand as the seatbelt sign switched off, gathering their belongings, stepping into the aisle. The usual impatience returned, but softer, less sharp than before. Keanu stood as well, reaching calmly for his small bag. No rush, no need to push forward. He waited, as he always did, letting others move first. The man behind him hesitated, then stepped forward into the aisle too, but not to pass him. To stand beside him. For a brief second, they were shoulder to shoulder. No audience now, no tension, just two people in the same space. "Take care," the man said. Keanu glanced at him, a faint smile forming. "You too." And that was it. No grand gesture, no dramatic ending, just a quiet exchange that carried more weight than anything loud ever could. As the line began to move, Keanu stepped forward, disappearing gradually into the flow of passengers exiting the plane. Just another traveler among many, but not quite. Because what he left behind wasn't visible. It couldn't be packed into a bag or captured in a photo. It lived in the silence that followed, in the way a man chose to walk differently after this moment, in the way a few passengers would think twice before judging someone too quickly, in the quiet realization that strength doesn't always raise its voice. Sometimes it barely speaks at all, and yet it changes everything.